Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revenue Launch Podcast. I'm your host, Randy Likas, and in today's episode, we will unpack how modern go-to-market organizations can align and scale in an AI-driven enterprise. We'll explore AI governance, adoption challenges, evaluating go-to-market tech stacks, all through an experimentation lens, and the differences between Agentic AI and Copilot AI as teams move from pilots to production. Joining me today is Stephanie Couzin. Stephanie is the Vice President of Go-to-Market Strategy and Operations at Lucid Software. With over 15 years experience across revenue, product, finance, and operations, and more than 8 years at Lucid, Stephanie partners closely with sales, customer experience, and marketing leadership to guide go-to-market decision-making, optimize revenue workflows, and drive execution at scale. She's known for leading complex cross-functional initiatives and translating data into clear, actionable insights that fuel sustainable growth. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Randy.
Stephanie, I usually like to start these episodes, maybe if you can just give us a little bit of your background, career journey, and maybe your current role at Lucid.
Yeah, sure. So I know you mentioned earlier my functional purview. So I manage 6 functional teams at Lucid, and we support Lucid's 450-person revenue organization. So that covers sales strategy and operations, customer success strategy operations, marketing operations, territory and capacity planning, performance management, and partner operations. And while I've been at Lucid for nearly 9 years, I'm actually relatively new to the revenue side of the house. This is my 3rd year on the job. So I joined Lucid very early on. We were around 200 employees, very small, and as I joined as our chief of staff. From there, I had stints leading our BizOps team, then our strategic finance team, and then about 3 years ago, when our head of RevOps left, I jumped at the opportunity and raised my hand. I had always wanted to work in a role more inside the business versus kind of on the business. And I'd worked very closely with the RevOps team in both my finance and BizOps roles. So it was a very natural transition, and I haven't looked back. It's been a ride.
That's wonderful. And it certainly is. You've got a great background, like you said, working on the business and working in the business and go to market. We're going to unpack a little bit throughout the episode. One thing, Stephanie, as I was preparing for our conversation, what I noticed is that I think very early, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but very early, Lucid was primarily a PLG company. And you made this transition to not just being a PLG, but PLG plus sales-led growth. Can you kind of walk us through that journey a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, we had a very storied history of a very robust and mature self-serve motion. And around when I joined the company, actually, but before I went into revenue, we had started layering on that sales motion. And over time, we added in segmentation. We have a very diverse customer base in terms of everything ranging from small SMB organizations all the way up to the enterprise. And also a variety of different industry verticals. And so over time, we've segmented our sales force. We've added in a lot more complexity into our post-sales motion and really have moved more into that enterprise space.
So one of the things that I wanted to talk with them about, specifically around the theme of experimentation and go-to-market, is how you, as you started building that sales-led growth muscle and moving away from PLG, some of the experimentation that you use to build that, right? Because I think product-led growth typically is around users, where sales-led growth is maybe around counts, right? Or customer segments. And so I'd love to hear and unpack what your thinking was around that and how you took sort of an experimentation mentality to build that muscle.
Yeah, absolutely. So early on at Lucid, we started experimenting with what we called our product qualified motion. I think many of you who work in product-led companies are familiar with more sophisticated lead scoring and certainly like signal optimization around identifying your highest value users, or users who have had those aha moments who are ready for that sales engagement. And where that really evolved over time was to also identify at the account level, what are the account level signals that we need to be identifying in order to then make sure that we're outreaching to accounts at the right time with the right messaging to those accounts. And then layering in, as you move further up market, who we're reaching out to isn't necessarily the same users that perhaps we were reaching out to earlier in our journey with those product signals. And so that's the marrying of both the internal and external signal optimization data that really makes for the kind of special sauce of our lead scoring engine.
And so when you think about some of those signals, because I think a lot of times people talk about signals, they look at signals that maybe are happening through third party, either intent data. I think it's different in your motion because a lot of it is in product, like people that are maybe not necessarily an enterprise using it, but there's some active pockets of people that are using it, but you want to scale that up to the enterprise. So I would love for you to maybe unpack what signals look like for you. It could be third party, right? But some of what those other signals that you look for or optimize for.
Yeah, sure. I'll give an example of actually something that's both first and third party, and particularly at the account level. So Lucid has a variety of integrations that allow you to really make more of all of our capabilities. And as part of that, we certainly see certain signals in product from accounts and users at those accounts that are using a certain integration in a way to get more value out of Lucid to solve a specific problem. At the same time, we also have accounts that perhaps either aren't using a particular integration, or perhaps they have the integration installed but aren't using it. And we know from third-party data that we should be reaching out to them because they can get more value from using Lucid if we were to get that set up for them. So that would be an example of something where we're both using kind of internal data and external data to help our users and our accounts get more value from Lucid.
Was that, like, again, think about our theme of like experimentation, like how did you get to that insight of being able to structure that? Was that like something you sort of tested and refined, or kind of unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, certainly I couldn't even tell you how long we've been testing these types of signals in order to arrive at our current framework for how we think about signal optimization. But I would absolutely say that there are a set of more or less like an account checklist that we deem internally to say, wow, this account is locked and ready to expand, right? And they have all of that special recipe. And if you don't have that recipe, then it becomes very easy for us to say, if we know that you use this particular chat app internally, we know that you use this particular documentation app internally, we know that we can make Lucid all the more valuable to you. And so it really allows us to have a conversation about how you get more value.
That's wonderful. Is it a challenge to align teams internally around experimentation, or what do you see as when you're looking to experiment different motions or different plays that are changed from how you've done things? Like, what's the best way to get that cross-functional alignment for experimenting with different go-to-market motions or plays?
Sure. And in nearly every situation, because we're in revenue, testing something new will impact someone's variable compensation, right? So it's critical that when we test, we set it up as a win-win situation. So every rep or every CSM involved is fully bought in. Because if they're not fully bought in, we aren't going to see the results that we need. So this may mean that you have to get pretty creative. I can give an example. So last year we wanted to test a new coverage structure on our accounts in our SMB segment. And we took an open backfills accounts, and then we did some trades with existing reps in seat so that we could test on some kind of lower value, or I guess another way to put it would be accounts that we didn't need to engage with right away, so that we could test on those accounts, relatively low risk, low sample, while making it worth it for our counterparts in revenue, because that team definitely wanted to pick some better accounts, right? So it was a win-win situation. We got to test something that would ultimately benefit them, but didn't provide a lot of risk in their near-term variable compensation.
And is there a lot of organizations sometimes when they look at testing a motion, like maybe the example you just had given, you got to have a sort of culture of being open to that experimentation. Sometimes those experiments fail, right? And so I think one of the things that you had mentioned before is it's really only possible when you've got the right cultural conditions that encourages that. And I would just love to hear from you in terms of, like, when you think about experimentation and go to market or designing different plays, what role does that play, the support or the freedom to experiment and the risk of failure? And maybe you can guide some leaders in terms of some of the ways in which you've structured open ideas without sort of risk of failure.
Yeah. Psychological safety, I think is what you're getting at. It's paramount. It's paramount both for our RevOps team, but also for our partners in revenue. I teach a class in Lucid's leadership development program about this very topic, and we base it around a really interesting study that Google did called Project Aristotle, if you're familiar. And Google had studied internally an enormous data set over several years to try and figure out, like, what's that recipe for the highest performing team. They even looked at like SAT scores from 10 years ago, and the single largest determinant of a team being successful was the team had this sense of psychological safety. They could speak up without fear of consequence. They felt the freedom to make mistakes and to fail fast, right? So psychological safety is just so paramount. And as a leader, you alone can create this environment. This is not about being polite. It's actually about being really intentional, ensuring that everyone on your team feels that they can be vulnerable. So modeling that kind of vulnerability and fallibility yourself, and that they can speak up without consequence, and also they just have that freedom to make mistakes, which is what you mentioned earlier, right? So in terms of some practical things that you can do as a leader to create an environment with that sense of psychological safety, I think that the easiest thing for any leader to do is to make sure that sharing learnings is an imperative. It's a place where we can all find inspiration in one another. My team has a regular cadence of project show and tells across our teams, and we find a lot of inspiration from one another. Our enterprise sales team has a weekly cadence of what they call Smart Fridays, where they're sharing plays with one another. They're sharing interesting new ways to use AI with one another. And these are both examples of how we benefit from this sense of collective intelligence in a team or in an organization, right? So I think sharing learnings is one of the easiest ways we can do this. And then specifically in RevOps, as a leader, you have to set an expectation that being really close to the business, being close to the front line, being close to the plays, it's a core competency, right? And so in that sense, you're saying the subject matter expertise I expect to come from you means that I am looking for everyone to speak up, right? That is part of your role. It's not something for you that you have to have uncertainty or take a bet on. And then lastly, I think it's really important to make sure that even though everyone is afraid of failure, making kind of like a distinction between a preventable failure, like from negligence, from ignorance, right, from lack of effort, versus an intelligent failure, which was something that we failed at because we tried something and we learned something from it, right?
Yeah. Is there I'm curious, I'm sure there's no shortage of ideas, right? Everybody wants to run a pilot or do something new. And if I'm hearing you correctly, like you as part of RevOps, it's almost is it like you're the facilitator of the process in terms of bringing the right people in to foster that experimentation? And with that, if you are a facilitator, how do you decide like which experiments you invest in and which ones you don't?
Yeah, sure. That's such a great question. I think we have within our sales strategy and operations team and within our CX strategy and operations team, we have a cadence of business partnering. And so I would say we don't try to compete between for one segment versus another segment or for one division versus another division. It's something that you can actively work on with your business partner to say, I have a hypothesis that if we were to try this differently, that this could change, right? And so then it's up to the business partner on my team to say, we could absolutely measure that. We think that we should try this for a quarter. Let's secure resourcing. Let's draw up a project brief. Let's get all the cross-functional players aligned because we think we can move something here, right? So I think it's less so competing against ideas against one another and more so saying, what is it that we're trying to achieve this quarter and what could we do differently in order to achieve that, right?
Yep. And what kind of time horizons do you typically look at in something like this? Is it a quarterly project? Is it a H1, H2 type of thing? If we're not, depending on when your fiscal is, we either just started 26, fiscal 27, or about to, right? Is that sort of, you prioritize the level of complexity of the project and measure them accordingly? Like how does that cadence look as far as how you set out on a project and then how do you measure it?
Yeah, firstly, I mentioned before that we have sales teams from SMB all the way up to the enterprise. Depending on what you're trying to test, you have to keep in mind anything that you keep in mind already because you have segmentation for a reason, right? Sales cycles might look different, procurement looks different, buying personas look different for each of those segments. So if you're trying to test something very quick, you could test something very quick to down segment because you get quicker signal, right? Those are shorter deal cycles and you could arrive at some results in a much shorter time frame. Versus if you're trying to test something in the enterprise segment, that's going to take much longer unless you're focusing more on pipeline metrics, up funnel metrics to say whether or not this thing is working. The other thing I would point out, you mentioned annual planning and the fiscal turnaround. We certainly want to give any changes that we're making in the fiscal turnaround enough time to bake, right? We're not going to try and go test something else in Q1 because then it's why didn't we just just decide that we were going to do this in the first place to start the year, right? But we do check-ins every quarter, and I would say about halfway through the year, we actually have a more formal offsite where we solicit a lot of feedback about what did we change this year, what's working this year, what do we think we want to try differently next year, which sounds a little crazier, like halfway through the year. But actually, it's a great way to de-risk ideas before saying, oh, we want to try and do them for the new fiscal year. If there's something that someone has tremendous conviction in at that kind of half-year mark, we should think about ways that we could test that for a quarter, for 2 quarters, so that we could have more conviction that we should be able to make that change in the new fiscal, right?
Yep. I know I'm going to caveat the question because it probably depends on the size of the experimentation or the pilot you're running. But I know that you had mentioned before that the experimentation is only possible when you've got the right data that you can test these new ideas. So I'd love to understand, like, what role does data play in these different tests and experiments? And again, maybe a little bit less when you're maybe a less risky initiative versus others. There are no shortage of data. Data exists everywhere. And so how much data do you need to have when you go into these pilots in order to run them?
Yeah, what a great question. I think first and foremost, in testing, full funnel accuracy is really important. So I think I hope everyone that's in RevOps has a lot of confidence in their revenue or bookings data, right, in your IRR. We know that is consistent, that is accurate, we can segment it in dozens different ways to derive insight. I think as you move further up the funnel, unfortunately, you have a little bit less confidence in being able to slice and dice that data, whether it's your pipeline data due to inputs that are required or differences in sales methodology or adherence to the standards that your organization has around sales stages, right? And so you have to become so much more confident in your upper funnel metrics, and then above pipeline even, then your activity metrics, right? And are folks logging everything? Are your systems integrated? Is your data pipeline working so that you can trust your data? And unfortunately, there's just always going to be fewer eyes on those up funnel metrics. So I think first and foremost, a unified data strategy means the accuracy of your full funnel view, right? And I promise you, every RevOps leader can do better here, myself included, right? I think you kind of hit on this in terms of cross-functional alignment. You have to have shared definitions across your go-to-market teams, right? You can't have sales defining a KPI one way, and even if it's for a really good reason, and then perhaps on how it's measured in one system, right? But customer success is defining that same KPI in a very different way, right? And this is our bread and butter in RevOps, right? We are the glue. So if we're setting out to move a metric, everyone needs to monitor the same metric in the same systems and the same dashboards so that we can actually move the metric.
Yeah.
And then finally, I would say governance, granularity of segmentation. And what I mean by that, and I could give an example. So we launched a go-to-market engineering pilot last year focused on outbound automation. And as we began evaluating the effectiveness of our automated outreach, it became clear that the tagging governance in our SalesLoft instance was going to inhibit us deriving quick insights. We just did not have the granularity required to categorize everything very cleanly, and it was going to prevent us from iterating faster. So this really reinforced how disciplined we wanted to be in our cadence tracking going forward. And in this sense, if you are focusing up funnel and on experimentation, it can help compel you to get your data in a better place, right?
Yeah.
And if you have a sense of which insights you want, then you can make sure that you're building your data in the right way.
So you mentioned something that is just so critical, and I think it's just also so hard for companies to do, which is get the cross-functional alignment aligned on the right metrics, the common metrics, the shared metrics, because it's so easy for each functional area to focus on their own slice of things. And we see it all the time. So I'm just curious, how do you align? You started to talk about it a little bit as far as what are the common metrics and things like that, but is there a certain framework that you use, or when you're kicking these things off, how do you align these cross-functional teams that have their own sort of initiatives going on, but are trying to work on something for the greater good of cross-functional for the company?
Yeah, that is absolutely something that RevOps can uniquely help with, right? We have that broad purview. I would say at a micro level, the account team knowing their responsibilities and having a shared set of planning activities is like absolutely critical. If folks on the account team don't understand what they should each be contributing and aren't on the same page about what they should be doing to drive an account forward, that's something that's a huge miss. And as RevOps, we can provide those templates and those frameworks so that they can do that together. Within our actual annual planning cycle, we make sure that we have, I wouldn't call it a waterfall approach, but we make sure that as part of our cadence of planning, we understand which decisions have dependencies on other decisions. And so we always actually start with sales book planning first, because as an example, our customer success book planning is going to be downstream from our sales book planning. And ensuring that we have alignment across those functions might mean that our customer success leadership has visibility along the way as to the decisions that we're making on the sales floor.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the way you're approaching that, a lot of companies could probably take some lessons, because that cross-functional alignment is so difficult. I'd love to just transition the conversation a little bit to talk about AI in general, and specifically within go-to-market. There's a lot of vendors that are coming up with their own agentic abilities, whatever they might be, but there's also a lot of companies who are saying it's not bespoke enough for our business, and so they're wanting to build their own AI go-to-market engines or systems to themselves. When you think about the opportunities that AI presents itself in go-to-market, what are your thoughts? Do you agree with that sort of flavor of we have a tendency or a bias maybe to build our own and customize it? Or do you look for the vendors that you use and the AI capabilities that they have? And what's the process, I think, that you, or the framework that you use to evaluate whether we should build or whether we should buy?
Sure, yeah. I think in the last several years, I think we've seen more and more tension between a push for like best of breed tooling versus increasing consolidation in these all-in-one platform plays, right? And from a workflow optimization standpoint, the fewer tabs that we have our reps and our CSMs in, the more productive they are, like hands down. And certainly, like the fewer places that we as RevOps have to integrate data piping, for instance, the more performant our systems are, right? But what's most so interesting about recent developments in AI is that the more you can have everything in one platform, also the more powerful that platform's AI can be in terms of helping your workflow, instead of having siloed AI assistants in each of those different applications, right? But as an organization, we standardized on Google Gemini as our kind of horizontal AI solution. And this has sparked like a myriad of new and interesting use cases. Of course, though, it's outside of our go-to-market tech stack. But they usually still require a few manual steps from a human because it's outside of our go-to-market tech stack. They aren't centrally orchestrated yet, if you will. So they're not scaled. But because we've standardized on it, it actually allows us to draw a lot more inspiration and from various, I tried this here, or I was toying with this. And it allows us to think about how could we scale that and how could we derive more value if that was a little bit more integrated into a workflow. So I think standardizing on what you, or being very clear with your sales and CS floor about what you would like them to be using is incredibly important in terms of AI adoption.
That's great. I would love to talk about, I think, a distinction that you had made in the green room, which is the difference and the distinction between agentic AI and Copilot AI. How should go-to-market teams evaluate these two categories? How do expectations differ when piloting each of those?
Yeah. Oh, what a great question. A lot of the buzz in the AI space right now is often around the potential to replace human work with agentic AI. Oh my gosh, AI is coming for our jobs. And the measures are on agentic AI are in terms of cost savings from not having a human do the work. And in many cases, what you're looking for there is actually like a do no harm or a parity goal. It's a replacement of a human, right? But I would actually draw a huge distinction from that, because in working with revenue teams, like what most of the time the AI technology that we're adopting or considering or exploring is actually more assistive AI. It's how can we make these teams more productive, right? How do we enhance their existing workflows? And how do we allow them to have more time with the customer as a result of enhancing those workflows? And unfortunately, as opposed to saying, oh, this is very cleanly cost savings, it can be more challenging to actually measure the value of of the kind of incrementalism of enhancing someone's workflow. Like, how do you measure their productivity from them being able to draft an email, right? From them being able to do some account research and account prep they didn't used to have to do from a manual perspective, particularly because they're having to engage with that content in some way. It is not a fully kind of replacement function. But I think that's where the special sauce is going forward, and that's where we're going to get so many gains for our revenue teams.
Yeah, 100%. I think, what I really want to double click on is your comment around like human first. I think we have to approach AI from not necessarily letting the system drive everything, but humans define what matters and where we think it's going to help make improvements in our day-to-day. The systems are what help scale that, help make it more efficient. But starting with the AI first isn't necessarily the best thing. It's what problems do we face as sellers, as CSMs, and then using that to develop the insights first from a human standpoint, and then let the AI drive that and scale that.
That's such a great point. One of the things that absolutely drives me nuts, but it comes from a good place, is we can all get a bad case of shiny object syndrome because there is just so much new AI technology in the market, right? And so what we often ask revenue partners to explain to us when they have a particular tool that they really want us to explore from a RevOps perspective is, actually, let's get down to the brass tacks of what use case are you trying to solve instead of what tool do you want?
Yes.
Because chances are there's something within our existing go-to-market tech stack that could solve that use case, or that we could piece together at least to prove out what we're trying to get at. So thinking in terms of use cases as opposed to tools, I think is really important as we all get more mature in our understanding of how AI is going to make us better.
Yeah. Is that part of your like AI governance structure? Is like, what's the use case that we're looking to solve? And I guess more broadly, if you think about your AI governance, I don't call it policy, but your structure, like what does that look like inside your organization? Because I'm sure you're getting probably requests all the time. Let's try this AI application, or let's try this. You can't do everything, right? And I think start with the use case, start with the problem is probably part of it. But what is it broader than that, I guess would be my question.
Yeah, my biggest recommendation to anyone is, this may sound far too simple, but standardize on something. Because if you don't, you're just going to be in a constant game of whack-a-mole. Certainly in any revenue use case, you're dealing with sensitive customer data and just numerous data points. So it's a very heavy lift for any system. And the power of it will only come if you can put all those things together. So we're a Google shop, and we standardized on Google Gemini, and it really sparked just like so much experimentation and really just a lot of new interesting use cases. And certainly as being a horizontal AI app, it's not going to solve every revenue use case, but what it does is it creates kind of inspiration for, okay, that's interesting. Could we figure out how to orchestrate that within our systems? Or that's interesting. The next time we're evaluating X, Y, or Z type of tool, let's make sure that we're considering how important that one use case was. Because the last thing you want is for a rep or a CSM to have to upload something manually just to get something out, then go somewhere else and port that over. We want to have a very seamless workflow.
Yeah. Well, let's transition to what we call a little bit more of the lightning round. And I'd just love to get your perspective, just going to what you mentioned at the top, where you're fairly new to RevOps, right? 3 years now in, after working on the business for a while. What was your biggest surprise about RevOps, kind of when you started your role, and what stayed true, and maybe what hasn't?
Yeah. Oh gosh. So definitely back when I was working more on the business or in that finance role or that BizOps role, I think we spent a lot of time trying to drive accountability, or there's a sense of like creating structure. It was interesting how quickly I took the kind of torch of representing the revenue point of view. It didn't take long for me at all to become impassioned and to drive that solidarity. That was something that definitely, it flipped a quicker switch than I thought it would have.
Yeah, that's great. Anything surprise you when you took the role that you didn't know before?
How much more impactful you can find your day-to-day if part of your day-to-day is being able to take something from ideation to fruition. It's such a fun part of being in revenue, and there's just the pace of change is just, it's fantastic.
Yeah. What's the favorite part of your job?
It's never boring. Working at a rapidly scaling company, especially in revenue, and in an industry that's changing so fast, I get to solve new problems every day, and it's just never a boring day.
Yeah, for sure. It's always going to be a flip side to that question, which is least favorite, or sometimes I ask the question a little bit different, which is what's really hard about your job?
Yeah, least favorite, I have to say, occasionally I have to play like the role of referee when it comes to upholding the rules of engagement. Having been a former ice hockey player, like no one likes a ref, right? Actually, one of my favorite quotes from one of our enterprise leaders when I started this role was, "I never met a RevOps person I liked." I was just like, okay, that's a low bar to have. So let's see if I can change your mind there.
You got it. So so former ice hockey player. So what parallels between ice hockey and revenue operations do you see or can you draw?
Well, certainly there's the balance between offense and defense. And there's always, I think one of the things we like to say is there's two ways to grow a business. You can sell more or you can retain more. And so it's always good to keep focus on both motions, right? And to make sure that as a business, we're fostering frameworks and processes that really help our pre-sales, sales, and post-sales motions work really well together. And because the best offense is a good defense, the best defense is a good offense.
Absolutely. Do you have favorite book, or could be revenue operations, could be just more generally that you either like to go back to and read? Maybe it's been a while that you read, or when people ask, hey, any good book recommendations, that the first one that comes to your mind?
Okay, so one book that I absolutely love that I think is applicable for anyone that works in business, even beyond business, but not necessarily related to RevOps. It's a book by Greg McCune, I hope I'm saying that correctly, called Essentialism. And if you never read the book, here's the AI summary that is so important. The etymology of the word priority was actually such that there was no such thing as having priorities, plural, until the 20th century with the dawn of businesses saying that they had multiple priorities. And I think the lesson to be learned from there, and again, the name of the book was like Essentialism, right? Is that if you have focus on one thing, if you have a priority, it is so powerful in terms of execution if you have just one thing that you focus on and are very intentional about.
I love that. I wrote that book as you were writing down. I'm going to add that to my list. Stephanie, last question, and then we'll wrap up. So any advice that you've received from someone that has stayed with you over the years that you would share with the audience?
Yeah, I love when people ask me this question because I always cite something from way too long ago, but I think it still applies to my professional career. So I mentioned earlier I played ice hockey, and in college our hockey locker room had a sign on it just as you were exiting to get onto the ice, and it was, the only thing that you can control today is on the ice. The only thing that you can control on the ice today is how hard you work. And that has stayed with me all throughout my professional life. Not as a mantra to like doggedly work exhaustive, long 80-hour work weeks or whatever, but just a reminder to focus on what you can control. Ignore the noise. Don't beat yourself up. And if you focus on what you can control, you're going to find results.
Wonderful advice. I love that. So, well, listen, we're coming up on time, so I want to just say thank you very much for spending the past 45 minutes with me. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your wisdom. If folks that are listening want to get in touch, what's the best way?
Yeah, sure. Reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Sounds great. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for joining me today. That is another episode of the Revenue Lounge. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Have a good one.
Thank you so much, Randy.
Of course.